Jameson Williams is benefiting from the not so hot take offseason buzz, but should he really be considered our wide receiver one? That more today on the Dynasty Newsletter. I'm your host, Adam Wilde, joined by my co host, Chris Allen. Chris, we'll do something a little bit different today. Instead of addressing Jameson Williams right away, let's just go through our wide receiver ranks and see how far we get before we get to Jameson Williams. That's kind of going to answer the question naturally. Do we think that Jameson Williams will be our wide receiver one? And I will kick that over to you first to start with your wide receiver one and a little bit about why that player is your wide receiver one.
My wide receiver one for right now is Garrett Wilson. Looking at his college production overall from insert stat here, and he pretty much leads the Packer, at least fairly impressive or very impressive with where he sits up at the top. I mean, career yards per route run, dominator age, like, because we do want, like, for most of the folks in Dynasty community that look at things from an analytic perspective, like like how much of a player's offense they account for that dominator rating. I mean, career dominator rating, like just over 20%, if I'm remembering correctly. I mean, at best, he meets that threshold for 30%, which a lot of analysis for Dynasty, especially for wide receivers, they want that their wide receivers to hit that 30% threshold. So I think like everything kind of speaks, like everything about his game kind of speaks to the fact that he can be, he has been just a number one like wide receiver within his offense. And then for what teams are looking for this season, now are they going to be able to find? I don't think he has the same star power as, let's say, the class that we saw a couple of years ago. But I do think overall, like within his class, like Garrett Wilson, to me, stands out as the wide receiver one for 2022.
Yeah, and we're always pretty much in lockstep with our top three wide receivers for the 4 years we've been working together. Garrett Wilson has become my wide receiver one as well. A lot of my wide receiver opinion ends up revolving around where it seems like they're going to go in the drafts. Garrett Wilson seems like he's going to get probably wide receiver one overall buzz. He's definitely getting top 10 buzz. We have a few teams in the top 10 that could be going wide receiver. And like it's in a year where it's so we're going to talk about 8 wide receivers that might go in the first round, right? We have to decide how we're going to value those draft positions, because in fairness, like a top 10 wide receiver probably gets a little bit of a bump, but if you're talking about George Pickens at 29, right? Like, okay, but he went to the Chiefs. So do you give more of a bump to George Pickens, or do you give more of a bump to Garrett Wilson, who went to the Jets, top 10? Like, it's where it's going to come down to kind of your analysis. Like, we all know about missing on A.J. Brown. A lot of people missed on A.J. Brown. His ADP ended up being like 110 in Superflex drafts. And a lot of that was because he landed with Tennessee. So you can look at some lessons like that and say, well, I liked Garrett Wilson more, 5 spots more than George Pickens, and he went top 10. So I like Garrett Wilson more, even though George Pickens goes to the Chiefs at 29. And that'll be perfectly fair. And then, but you can also see the other side of the things where it's the CEH situation, and George Pickens goes to the Chiefs, and he goes from wide receiver 6 to 1 or 2 in this class because he went to the Chiefs and he was still in the first round. So it's going to be a really, really interesting year. And I think that dynasty managers are going to be able to separate themselves by figuring out how you want to value those draft positions. And honestly, if we're going to talk about actually maybe 8. I kept saying 6 or 7 wide receivers could go in the first round. And then there's a couple names that have creeped their way in, which sounds ridiculous. But if we're talking about 8 wide receivers in the first round, it's probably just going to be a year where you need to stick to your guns and kind of forget about the draft position. Of course, factor in the team they go to a normal amount, but maybe just kind of stick to your post-draft analysis. So that's same player for wide receiver 1 for both of us. But go ahead with your second.
So for me, like coming in right behind him will be Treylon Burks. I think that he's still. I think it's mostly this the size speed combination. I mean, if we're looking at from a measurable standpoint, and again, what are teams going to be focusing on this year? Like the guys that, or at least the teams that we know are going to be hunting for a wide receiver, whether it's Green Bay, whether it's the Chiefs, whether it's even the Saints, who have been kind of in the rumors for whether it be for quarterback or they could use a wide receiver as well. I mean, but what is that archetype of player that they will want to be looking for. And I think Burks definitely has that. I know that there's still some concerns with him about his route running capability, and that's why I have like Wilson ahead of him, because from a separation, from an agility standpoint, and also from a just nuance, like watching Garrett Wilson run on tape, I think he definitely has Burks from a route running standpoint. He has that in spades. But I think if there's a team that would want to try and find a guy that can match up with some of the like NFL DBs, I think Burks definitely has that going for him at this point. So he'd be my wide receiver too.
And Treylon Burks is another case study that we're going to have where he's probably going to go a little bit later in the first as the wide receiver 3 and the wide receiver 4. We talked about on our other show last week how that might actually be a benefit. Just like I was just talking about with George Pickens, you're going to have to decide if the Chiefs is a huge bump for him or not. But the later these guys get drafted, the better teams they're going to get drafted to, and probably the better chance for them to participate early on. So a couple teams that he's getting mocked to is the Saints. Huge hole for them. We'll see how Michael Thomas comes back, but I can't imagine that we're going to get prime Michael Thomas, anything like that. So that would be a huge opportunity for them. And they just traded up, so you don't know exactly who they were trading up for, but definitely trading up in this class could always mean wide receiver when we're talking about 7 or 8 of them being in the first round. And then, of course, Green Bay, he could be an early producer there as well. We've had a lot of conversations that have revolved around Treylon Burks maybe not being ready to play with Aaron Rodgers. I don't know that he's any less pro-ready than anybody else. And, if you don't really know exactly what you're doing, ability certainly helps with that. So somebody that we would not necessarily comp Treylon Burks to, but in terms of his pre-draft situation, Treylon Burks is feeling a lot like what DK Metcalf felt like a couple years ago when we were going through that pre-draft process in which, DK ran the worst 4-3 cone that we could probably ever see, but he ran a great 40 and his route running ability was a 0 at that point in time. And I mean, of course, Jake Anderson wouldn't agree with the 0 for DK Metcalf's route running, but it was certainly suspect at the time. But you know what? We've given the Seahawks kudos multiple times for that rookie year for DK Metcalf. And basically, what did they do for him? They started the season out with a lot of screens and a lot of go routes. That's what we knew he'd be good at. For one, quick and big. Or fast and big, not so quick. So you get him the ball immediately and just let him go do what he needs to do. And they got him comfortable. And then by the end of the year, he was looking really good on posts. He was looking really good even on ends. And that's where he was really struggling was the stop and start. So you saw teams turn Seattle turn DK Metcalf, who ended up being a second round pick, which by the way will happen this year too. Probably one of these studs is going to end up going to the second round because there's just not enough room. But you saw a team take DK Metcalf, utilize him to his strengths, and kudos to the Seahawks for that. So I could see the same situation happening for Treylon Burks, where yes, maybe he is not the most refined route runner, and he started as both of our wide receiver ones, fell behind Garrett Wilson for that reason, and that he is just not quite refined enough to be that wide receiver 1. Pair that with the fact that he's being mocked behind both Wilson and Drake, who we'll talk about in the next couple picks. And that's going to push him to wide receiver 2 for me. But even if he's drafted behind Drake London, I still think I end up taking Treylon Burks ahead of Drake London. So that'll tee you up for your 3.
So my 3 is going to be the guy that we want to talk about is Jameson Williams. And I think that I'm not going to really ding him for the injury. Like most folks at this point, they've probably already seen the videos that they've already shown him. He's out running. I mean, rehab well underway. And regardless of where he's drafted at, from a health perspective, he should be ready to go like within the next few months. So like training camp and then week 1 of the 2022 season should be good to go. I'm also not going to ding him for transferring. I mean, if you look at the competition that he had at Ohio State, and then he moves from Ohio State to Alabama and is able to show out at Alabama, I mean, that's just, again, like, I'm not going to ding him for transferring as well, because look at the production almost on both sides of the trade, or not to trade, the transfer rather. So my only concern at this point for Jameson Williams, and this is me projecting my own thoughts on this, I'm not saying this is right, and this is just an assumption that I'm making about him, but if you look at the size speed combination that he currently has, like, we know that he is blazing fast. I mean, former track runner, so on and so forth. But at 6'1", 180, thereabouts, right? Like 175, 178, like somewhere in there,
Yep.
6'1".
Hopefully
So
180.
yeah, hopefully. I'm sure, like, with the injury and whatnot, he's probably dropped a couple of pounds. And then remember that whole thing with Marquise Brown, like, after he got injured, he dropped a ton of weight. So I can
He
see
did, yeah.
the same thing happening with Jameson Williams. The thing I'm projecting onto the situation, which is, again, wholeheartedly expect this to be wrong, but what if teams look at him and just say that, well, you're a skinny guy that can run fast, so we're going to pigeonhole you into this archetype of player. Like, we're going to pigeonhole you into the MVS role. We're going to pigeonhole you into the Deshaun Jackson role, which tactically is useful to an NFL offense, because you do need guys that are capable of running those clear out routes, so that if you do have a more experienced route runner that can actually execute those sail routes, high-low combos, like things like that, then that's where a guy like Jameson Williams would be useful. But it doesn't help him grow as an NFL receiver. Then also, that's definitely not useful to us from a fantasy perspective. You don't get points for route run. At least that's not a thing yet. So that's my only concern about Jameson Williams at all. This is, the team's going to see him, see what he can offer from that speed, and just say that, well, we'll use that. I just want to use that thing. Not the fact that he can separate, not the fact that he knows how to use his acceleration or to gain separation, or even once he does have the ball in his hands, how he can be fluid with his movements in order to break away from coverage or break away from defenders, like in the open field. So I think all of the skill sets that he has demonstrated over the years shows that he could be a star wide receiver. I mean, there's definitely he has those tools, and he can continue to develop those tools once you get in there. Again, my only concern is, some GM is going to look at him and say, this is going to be a star prospect, but then a coach is going to look at him and say, yeah, I'm just going to use this one thing because I need that one thing out of him in order to help one of my other pass catchers get open. So I'm going to use Williams to do that. So that's my only concern, but I have him at 3.
So you got a lot of my wheel spinning on that. I'm going to try to hit all of the points. He's my 4, so I've got Drake London ahead of him. But for the sake of conversation, we'll start with Jameson Williams. A couple things. So first, isn't it nice to not hear much about BMI this offseason? Like, did everyone just get exhausted with Devonta Smith last year? And now we just don't, because we have like 3 or 4 wide receivers with quote unquote BMI concerns right now. And we're not arguing about it, at least not yet. I mean, we still have time before the draft for people to start arguing about the BMI, but I think everybody just exhausted themselves last year, so we didn't have to hear about it this year. You're seeing a lot of those wide receivers still get drafted highly, all the way back to John Ross. Henry Ruggs had a low BMI, and he was first one off the board. Jalen Waddle last year, kind of small, but leading into my point, Jalen Waddle we were worried he was going to be pigeonholed into that sort of deep, quick roll or deep, fast roll. Same thing we were concerned about with Henry Ruggs, to be honest with you. Then we got the same concern with Jalen Waddle, where we were worried that he was just going to be the go deep guy. And then it turned out that he did get pigeonholed into a role, but it was the Jarvis Landry role. It was not at all what we expected Jalen Waddle to be. And I don't know that it's necessarily better or worse. Probably better, because that means he got peppered with targets. Maybe the ADOT wasn't as high as we would have liked or would have expected, but that can develop. At least he's getting the targets. And now with Tyreek Hill playing alongside him, you're going to see Jalen Waddle being able to expand and have a lot open for him. So you do worry about getting pigeonholed into the role for Jameson Williams. However, if he were playing alongside Stephon Diggs, for example, then that concern would go away quickly, and we would have time to adjust before our rookie drafts after the NFL draft to the fact that he's playing with, Josh Allen. I will say at the beginning of the offseason, Jameson Williams was like the consensus wide receiver 5 or something like that. And I usually don't like to see a big jump like from 5 to 3 or 6 to 3 without anything newsworthy happening, because that means that we're double counting. However, it makes sense because we were really concerned about Jameson Williams' injury. I know a lot of people speculated he could even miss close to half the year. And now it's looking like he might not even miss maybe mini camp. He's supposed to be running full speed by the draft. So he
Right.
might even participate in rookie mini camp. And at that point, maybe you're ahead of the curve by bringing him up to 3. I guess the only thing that's going to make it difficult is, again, Drake London's almost definitely going to be drafted ahead of him. And then you're going to have to say, well, how much am I valuing draft pedigree? If it's a
Hmm.
couple picks, Calvin Ridley and DJ Moore were back to back. It didn't make me put Calvin Ridley above DJ Moore or vice versa.
Yeah.
So when these wide receivers are so close, I mean, if Jameson Williams goes to the Bills, that is going to be a situation where it's going to be tough for him not to be the wide receiver 1, because fully healthy Jameson Williams might be the most talented. It's just we didn't know he was going to be fully healthy. He's going to be the 4th off the board potentially. And so that could be a bit concerning. And then the last point I wanted to make, it might have been Derek Brown when we talked to him last week, who said he transferred to Alabama. Like, so I see both sides of the argument, because he left Chris Olave and he left Garrett Wilson.
And
Both of
Jackson
those
Smith and
players.
Jigba.
Yes, great point. Both of those players are in this draft class. So it's totally fair to say, well, Jameson Williams left competition that he's competing with to be drafted ahead of in the NFL, and for that matter, your rookie drafts. Okay, that is a fair point. However, he didn't transfer to Liberty. He transferred to Alabama, who also have some fantastic wide receivers.
Hmm.
So it's not as though he transferred to lower competition. In fact, he transferred to the same level of competition. So you don't really, it's a fun stat to throw out, or maybe a fun point to make, or jab if you're not a fan of Jameson Williams, but it's a wash, man. I mean, he didn't want to compete with Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, but he still went to Alabama, and he still had a large portion of that offense with obviously fantastic talent around him. So
Hmm.
I'm not gonna knock him for that. I will head over to Drake London, who I'm assuming is he year 4,
Yep.
wide receiver 4. Okay, so that's our first flip flop. And if Jameson Williams goes to the Bills, I'm telling you, it's going to be tough to keep him at 3. But
That's fair.
anyways, for now, we don't know where he's going to go. So I'm going to go with Drake London, who looks like he could still be the wide receiver 1 off the board. It's kind of seems to be a consensus toss up between he and Garrett Wilson. But Drake London probably has the best tool set to translate to the NFL at this point. He's like the do it all, that he can do everything pretty good. I don't think he does anything particularly great. Like, I
Hmm.
think Garrett Wilson is a great route runner. I don't know that Drake London is great at anything, but he's really good at everything, and he's very big. So those are two things that the NFL really likes. They don't want you to mess up, and they want you to be freaking big when you get off the bus. So Drake London's got those two things going for him. And like I said, right now I'm going to lean into a lot of what mock draft Twitter, the people with their ears to the ground in the NFL are saying. If they're going to value Drake London as potentially the wide receiver 1 off the board, I'm going to keep him at 3 for now, just because I can't really think of any legitimate questions for Drake London. I mean, maybe people who dig in way, way, way more into film than me, they'll find knocks. You'll find knocks for every prospect, but there's really nothing that stands out in Drake London's profile that says you should stay away from him. It's just he doesn't have that one, like you've said in the past episodes, that superpower.
Hmm.
He doesn't have that one superpower that makes him stand out. So since he's not flashy, he's the wide receiver 3. If he's the first wide receiver off the board, we might have to reconsider that. But why do you have him at 4?
Because if I'm trying to put myself in the position of most of the NFL GMs, and if you look at most of the star wide receivers, and like almost on a historical basis, and I might have to ask our own Jordan McNamara about it, as if this has been true or not, but speedsters normally wind up getting all the attention. I mean, if you want to go all the way back to even like John Ross, like guys that we didn't think had like a ton of talent,
Right.
but even afterwards, like they wound up catching all of the highlights because that's what the NFL likes. So if we're already talking about Jameson Williams, we're talking about Treylon Burks, I mean, even Chris Olave to some extent, but we're talking about those guys that they can get after it from a speed perspective. Drake London doesn't have that. And if we can at least not necessarily agree, but if we can at least acknowledge that the NFL does value that speed, then why can't we just say that like those guys are going to be the ones to get to take most of the value away from Drake London, at least from that perspective? But I 100% agree. I mean, from a route running perspective, Drake London has all of the tools required in order to really excel. I mean, and I don't even think he requires any sort of like special system to be a part of, right? Because anybody sees or hears like route running capability, and they're like, oh yeah, we'll just stick him in some sort of West Coast offense or stick him with Kyle Shanahan, like so we can get the ball in his hands, that sort of thing. He doesn't need that, really. I mean, he can excel on any of the routes that even an average NFL quarterback should be able to hit, whether it's like RPOs, crossers, anything like that. Like very much let's see, what's my best guy to compare it to? Maybe somebody like Michael Pittman, who he doesn't excel at like one thing, but if you need him to go up and get like snag a contested catch here and
That's
there,
a
he can
fair
do
point.
that. If he can, if you need him to do a like intermediate crossing route, like he can do that. But are you expecting him to take over a game? No. But can he operate as a 1B to, a 2A across from, a solid split end? Yes. So I do see that Drake London, like if he does wind up falling to the Jets, I think that's a perfect situation for him because you can already see the type of offense that they're trying to install. Like, even if we do have concerns about Zach Wilson, but he does have the opportunity to operate across whether it's Corey Davis, Elijah Moore, but other players within that offense that can run similarly that would allow him to get open and then do the thing that he does best. I mean, he can break away from coverage, not with his speed, but just with his technique. And that's what it will allow him to move the chains. And from a fantasy perspective, I would say that that type of situation, that type of archetype of player just becomes more appealing from a fantasy sense, because that's essentially what I don't even want to bring him up, because if you associate an elite player with a rookie prospect, then everyone's trying to say that you're making a
You're gonna get
comparison.
canceled.
Yeah, not trying to say this at all. But in the way that some of those like big slot receivers in the past have done, where they use their route running ability and they have become fantasy superstars, because we know that they're creating separation. We know they're getting open. We know that they're getting the targets. So regardless of what his QB situation winds up being, if let's say if Drake London is tethered to Zach Wilson, then still he does have the tool set in order to become fantasy relevant. It just might take some time because of the offense that he's in, not because of Zach Wilson, but just because he's playing with Elijah Moore in his second year, Corey Davis, who has at least established himself as a guy that can earn some targets. And so he would wind up being, let's say, the second, possibly third option in the Jets offense.
Yeah, and we know what Robert Saleh is trying to do with that offense too. We don't know how involved he is with the offense within that team, but we know that he is taking the system from the Kyle Shanahan tree, and he's probably going to want his wide receivers to play multiple roles, and that's going to be somewhere where Drake London could excel, because if he got into the slot early in his career and found some early success, I really feel like confidence is an underrated factor that we don't like to talk about because there's no analytics to support it. But getting confidence early in your career, just like we talked about with DK Metcalf, he couldn't run refined routes to start his career, so they just let him play football. And if you got in a situation like that with Drake London, I think that would be perfect for him. You made a good point. He probably doesn't necessarily need a certain type of system. I do believe that system would fit him well with the Jets, but he also has experience playing with a poor quarterback play, so that would be helpful as well with Zach Wilson. It really lends its hand to like how important it is going to be for him to get targets early on, because the targets aren't going to be quite that valuable, and then he gets knocked a lot for his separation, but he was being underthrown. These balls were out of reach. I mean, if you put a staple on, a lot of his poor separation is because he had to come back to the ball and things like that, or go up and get the ball. So he's got great ball skills for his size. I think that would transition really well to the NFL. We might as well go ahead and hit on our five, and then I want to kind of broaden wide receiver picture in the landscape of the whole draft, really, and see if we can shed some love on the 2022 draft to get people more excited and not looking to 2023 already. But for wide receiver 5, I've got Chris Olave. Is that the same for you? Okay, then I'll let you hit on Chris Olave first.
I mean, to be quite honest, I wouldn't be surprised if any team looks at his production and says that he should be, at least from a talent perspective, the wide receiver 1. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I mean, if we want to look at the like his breakout age, like, matches favorably with any of the guys that we're talking about, like 20 years old, from a from a dominator perspective, like 33%, like it was his best dominator rating, so also compares favorably with the number 1 guys. Everything kind of lines up. I mean, if you were to like we were talking about with each of the like Wilson or Burks or Williams, like I think all of it kind of, if you wanted to rack and stack them and then just kind of, I don't know, like flip all the cards over and just like pick one randomly.
Yep, sure.
Not gonna be upset about it at all. I do think my biggest concern, like with Olave at this point, is his ability to, not the contested catch portion, but yards after the catch. Like we did see it, like I have seen like a number of cases where trying to like trying to force miss tackles, things along that line. I mean, that's where I do see like some of like his game not translating as well as the other 3 or 4 prospects we've already discussed. But overall, I mean, how are you supposed to? I mean, that's the only other detractor I can see like from the other guys we've mentioned so far.
Yeah, I hate the term raw because it's not really even a fair term to say because it's like technically they're all raw. They've never played in the NFL before. So
Yeah,
if you
that's a
had to
less
give,
refined. How about that? If you want to,
yeah, I was gonna say we need a better adjective that's like more kind to these players that are embarking on this journey that is infinitely more difficult than what they were excelling at previously. But if I guess if we had to say who was maybe the least ready for day one NFL competition, it might be Chris Olave, and maybe that's why he's wide receiver 5. But the reason that this draft is weird slash maybe fun is that if it's draft day and Chris Olave gets announced to the Jets at 10, like I'm not super surprised. I don't know that I'd even bat an eye. I would say, okay, well, I guess I'm going to start working on my ranks now. So, it's the top 5. It's like, it's really hard to say a lot of bad things about Chris Olave. It's just that the other guys are better. And sometimes that's the way it works out. So that's how our top 5 shakes out, all the same except for swap Drake London and Jameson Williams. Check out the Jameson Williams wide receiver 1 video from Alfredo Brown. Last week, he did a short on why he thinks Jameson Williams is the wide receiver 1. But now I want to take a look at this class as a whole, and we'll talk Superflex because that's what most of us play in. But if you're not playing in Superflex, just subtract the 2 quarterbacks and it's the same thing. We're all excited about 2023 because everyone is aware by now that 2022 is not quite as talented as in years past. And I'll give you some low-hanging fruit here in a second to go after, but I do want to make the point that we're looking at potentially 8 wide receivers in the first round, probably 2 second-round running backs, and maybe 3 second-round running backs, and at least 2 quarterbacks in the first round. At least latest mocks are saying that. I know earlier in the offseason we were talking about maybe no quarterbacks in the first round. By the way, how crazy is that to go from maybe no quarterbacks in the first round to Malik Willis being mocked
yeah,
102? So it's been a lot of turmoil. So
it
that's
only
12
get
players.
worse as we get closer to the
That
draft.
that's fair, and that's 12 players right there that we're talking about in the first round and second round. Second round for running backs is a really sweet spot, and I still think there's a chance Breece Hall goes in the first round. But so to bring the rest of the players into the conversation and then riff off that for a minute, we already talked about those 5 wide receivers. Jahan Dotson has got a little bit of love for the first round. We've
Skyy.
also got George Pickens. Getting love for the first round, especially since the Chiefs got 2 picks. People love to mock George Pickens to the Chiefs. And then now Skyy Moore is getting first round buzz. Skyy Moore was a player that I thought would go mid-second, and he's getting some first round buzz. And if you wanted to, this almost definitely is not going to happen, but David Bell is getting early second round buzz. So that's even another one that could be 9. And, that's probably not going to happen, but when you get to the rookie drafts, I mean, first round is usually a big deal for wide receivers. I mean, if you get 4 first-round wide receivers, you're usually going to draft them in the first round of your rookie drafts.
Yeah.
So then at running back in the second round, and like I said, maybe the first round, you've got Breece Hall, and then you also have Isaiah Spiller, and then at quarterback you have and Kenneth Walker the third, and then at quarterback you have Willis and Pickett, right? So
Yeah.
we've got our 12 players. What are you so afraid of with the 2022 draft class? So as we get closer and closer to our rookie drafts, I'm starting to feel like maybe it used to be just going to actually, just as a few weeks ago, I said I'd probably trade the 108 in this class for a random 23 first right now. And as we get closer, I'm thinking maybe you just want to take the discounted 2022 picks and draft this year.
Mhm. Maybe. I mean, from a process standpoint, I think we've had this discussion beforehand. It's been so long since we've had this much, I don't want to say, I guess, variance at the like in the first round. Like not even from a like real NFL standpoint, but even from a dynasty standpoint too. Like we almost feel compelled to put the quarterbacks where we have them, but nobody's really falling over themselves to draft Kenny Pickett or Matt Corral or I mean anybody like other than Malik Willis, and Malik Willis primarily because of we can see the fantasy upside to Malik
Yeah,
Willis.
right.
But outside of those guys, I mean, even the when we were just having our conversation with Derek last week, what about the running back situation? I mean, the running backs outside of the top two, you can talk yourself into any of those guys, and especially once we find out landing spot, that list might get completely jumbled afterwards. So even with these like 5, 6, let's just say multiple wide receivers we're talking about in the first round, even there, I mean, as we are just talking through our top 4, top 5, you can switch that list up as well. So I do find myself kind of grinding some of these like these rookie mocks to see how each is kind of different, because those minute differences like the 105 versus the 107, that's a significant difference. I mean, if you look at like year over year how much value is placed into each of those picks, so trying to find out where the market's starting to settle. And then even this year, outside of like most of the years past, I'm finding myself doing a bit more recon, like within each of my leagues to see like, well, if I've got the 103, all right, well, what's everybody kind of feeling like? Either, if there are some guys trying to trade up, all right, what's the value looking like there? Or like, how are people trying to like feeling really about some of these prospects? And I think that's where a lot of your, I guess, the information that you would want in order to say, all right, well, do I really want to move out of this class or try and even move within this class? If it can find a couple of gems like that might be available in the second round, looking at you like James Cook, Rashad White.
Sure.
I mean, even some of the like the wide receivers that might be available on day 2, which I know the NFL teams are going to be targeting. So I think that's where it's been a little bit, I don't know, it's been more fun, to be quite honest, this year, because we do have much more many more options, and not in just the first and second round of our rookie drafts. Whereas in years past, it's basically, all right, you got the 107. This is who you're going to be drafting. If you don't want them, you're going to need to trade out of that spot, like today. And it's just now I feel like there's there's much more, I guess, ambiguity like for each, like for the first round. And I think I'd say through, let's say, the early part of the second round in most Superflex like rookie drafts for this season.
That's an excellent point. This year has been a lot more fun in that you don't have, like you said, at 107. I remember in years past just telling anybody who was listening to me, like, if you can trade up above 7, do it. Give a next year's first in some years because of how bad how big the difference is between 7 and 8. And you just don't have that this year. I mean, you're a fool to spend time arguing with somebody the difference between your wide receiver 5 and 6, or better point 4 and 5 right now before the draft,
Mm-hmm.
because it is just so close. But the low hanging fruit that I was referring to is that, well, yeah, maybe these players are getting drafted so early because there's no one good in the draft class.
Yeah.
And that is a fair point. We will have to see. It is strange to see still at this point in the month of the draft, maybe 5 players that could go off the board first overall. And even Aiden Hutchinson, who I think will probably go first overall,
Mhm.
is like they're thinking of him as like a really good support player. They're not thinking about him like Myles Garrett, for example. He's not being talked about in that vein. He's barely even being talked about as the best pass rusher. I mean, you still have Thibodeau that could go
Mhm.
first overall. So he's barely even being talked about as the best pass rusher. And even in that, he is being talked about as like a solid starter in the NFL, not really a game changer. And that's something we haven't seen in a long time. I don't know if we'll probably won't see it for a few more years of draft class without much excitement. There are things to be said about maybe coming out of the pandemic and how that may have changed things and the way we've been viewing football over the past 2 years,
Sure.
etc. There could be reasons, and this could just be a slight lull. And hopefully, as the rest of the world gets back to feeling a little bit more normal, maybe football will too. And in that sense, it would have made sense for you to change your 2022 picks in for some 2023 picks. But I guess the moral of the story is that's not so easy. You're probably talking about trading the 108 for a random 2023 first. And I guess the fairness in that is that the 112 is probably just as good as the 108 was this year. But you're hoping. You don't
Yeah.
know.
Mhm.
There's a lot of time between now and then for you to regret that decision. So I do believe trading back is super viable if we're talking about we can't decide between Jameson Williams and Drake London. Just trade back and let somebody else make the decision. I said earlier in the offseason, so we're talking super flex, so you probably want Malik Willis. You probably want Brees Hall. People coming around to Kenneth Walker the third, you probably want
Mhm.
him. So you get to 104. I don't like anyone enough at 104 to not trade back and get some more value and then pick who's left over. Um, I like Garrett Wilson a lot, but would I
Mhm.
rather have Treylon Burks and a mid second? Yeah, probably. So if you could get that done, that's definitely a viable option. And like you said, in years past, it hasn't been that exciting. Nobody wanted to trade back because after 107, it was just a cliff, right?
Yeah.
One question I thought of earlier that I wanted to toss to you when we got behind the mics today was how much better or worse do you feel like Malik Willis is being viewed compared to Jalen Hurts?
To be quite honest, I think he's been viewed a bit more positively. Like we still have questions, right? Going to a small school, even still with the small school tag on him, looking at his production, we can see the ceiling. But even still, like his efficiency numbers, they're good, not great. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think this was from Jim Sonis of FanDuel. He has one of the highest adjusted sack rate numbers for any rookie coming out. I mean, that's even with the mobility being one of the things in his toolkit. So, like, while from a fantasy perspective, I am excited to see him come out, I don't think we are really like he's not being put under the microscope as much as Jalen Hurts. At least I don't really see it as much because thinking about like Hurts' storyline, the his Tua kind of showing
Yep.
him up and
Yep.
then seeing him come into the league like shortly thereafter. And then now, even as he's been the quarterback for the Eagles, everyone has just kind of, I don't know, like not really an assumption, but it's just been in the back of everybody's mind that if they have a chance to move on from him,
They
whether
will.
it be
Right.
via trade or if they're looking in the 23 class, then they will. So
Sure.
I don't really, but it just depending on where Willis falls at, whether it's at 2 to the Lions or whether he goes to Seattle, I'm not getting that same vibe from him,
Yeah.
which is kind of weird to be honest, because I think if you were to put both of those prospects side by side, I would have taken Hurts 10 times out of 10, like over Malik Willis at this point.
Yeah, that's the thought process that I'm trying to go through. That's why I wanted to make that last quick point because I'm not comping the players um, one for one per se at all. It's just that you saw Jalen Hurts as a quarterback that wasn't polished. Now, he played against great competition. He
Hmm.
wasn't polished, but an NFL offense could look at them and say, I could develop him into being something very electric. Now, Malik Willis is getting the exact same thing. So, Malik Willis played against compared to Hurts, horrendous competition. But you
Mhm.
look at Malik Willis and you say, I know that NFL offenses are going to look at him and say, I can turn him into something extremely electric. The only difference is that Jalen Hurts was always going to be a second round pick. Maybe there was a little talk about him getting the back of the first, but he was pretty much always going to be a second round pick. Malik Willis might be the 102. And that's just these indicators that I'm talking about, that maybe this is the internal conflict that you need to have in this class. Maybe just the whole class as a whole needs to take maybe slight value dip. Maybe the 110 doesn't mean this year what it meant in the past, because if the top quarterback, the only quarterback worth a top 5 pick is Malik Willis, and we barely like him more than Jalen Hurts, or as you said, one for one, if you have no context, you probably would have wanted Jalen Hurts over Malik Willis. I can already see the level of competition argument being made. And if they're both talented with their legs, what's the difference, right? So
Yeah.
just these questions to ask ourselves: compared to former players, where would these players be? And adjusting ranks accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that's the uh, one of the, I guess, points we try and come back to quite often here on the show, is that trying to stick with your pre-draft or the pre-draft evaluation. Like, what do you think about them talent-wise? And if you have question marks, draft capital, while it might ease your pain in terms of drafting them, it shouldn't change your expectations for that player. I mean, that talent is still, that eval of their talent is still there. And the same thing for the wide receivers as well. I mean, of course, like one or two of these guys, or probably 3 or 4 of them, because of how many picks they have, they're going to go to great situations. They're going to be playing with Aaron Rodgers or Patrick Mahomes, or maybe the Bills do something crazy and one of them winds up playing with Josh Allen. I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
going to be those guys that are going to wind up in these great situations. But does that mean we need to wind up summarily overpaying for them because of that situation? If we had question marks pre-draft, the situation isn't going to change that.
Sure.
So, I mean, we can hope for the best, but if we can wind up, especially in this class, with, or we've been talking about this whole show, 6, 7, 8 wide receivers that might have, let's say maybe half of them will have first round draft capital, and maybe 3 or 4 after them are going to have early day 2 draft capital. If I can wind up paying, I mean, just a half of a round, like half of a like first round difference in order to get 75, let's say ish percent of the production, I'll take that all day long, because if other people are going to overpay for the situation, and I know I can find similar talent, like the Drake London thing, like Drake
Mm-hmm.
London might go to the Jets, but everyone's going to look at him and say, it's the Jets, it's Zach Wilson. There are already
Right.
2 other wide receivers there. I don't want them. But if we know going into the draft process that he is one of the top wide receivers in this class, then should we then just summarily just kick him to the back end of the first round and just say, okay, well, Treylon Burks, he got that first round draft capital. He got that landing spot with KC. So now he's going to be the 106. And Drake London is going to be the
Sure.
112. Like,
Sure.
I'll trade back then.
Right. I'll
And
trade
I'll
back.
go get Drake London then, if that's
Yeah.
going to be how the market's going to value him afterwards. So it's just a good thought exercise to go through as we continue
Sure.
to, get more buzz and see more hot takes from the media as to who wants this player here at this pick. It's just going to make the market fluctuate even more, but your draft evaluation should remain static throughout.
Sure. So the moral of this all season is bask in the internal conflict and power through it. But that's going to do it for us today. Thank you for joining us. Please like, subscribe, rate, review, and head over to footballguys.com. Subscribe, save time, worry less, win more. Peace. Peace.